Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and I'm very excited to have Joshua Kloke, who covers Canadian soccer and the Toronto Maple Leafs for The Athletic, to come on and talk about his career, the senior men's national team, and most importantly, his new book, The Voyageurs, which comes out October 4th, detailing the history of the Canadian senior men's national team. And I'm very excited to read this book. I've read a bit of the preview. It looks really good. As a big soccer junkie, especially for the Canadian men's national team, I'm super amped. So, how's it going, Joshua? And thanks for coming on.
Oh man, thank you very much for having me on. This is awesome.
Yeah. So, before we get started into the to your book, The Voyageurs, I wanted to first ask a bit about your career. When did you first think you might want to pursue a career in sports journalism and writing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for a lot of sports journalists, you kind of are just very naturally drawn into maybe not necessarily a specific role, but you're just drawn to the profession because I'm sure like anyone listening right now, you're obsessed with sports. You're thinking about sports. You're talking about sports. You appreciate sports more than just kind of a passing hobby or something, to watch at the end of the day. And yeah, I love sports, and I actually got started in music journalism.
Hmm.
I was a teacher.
Oh,
I
cool.
went abroad. Yeah. I, much to the chagrin of my parents, I left university. And I guess all this shows is that there's no linear path to wherever you want to
Mhm.
be. I left university after 3 years because I was, not happy about where I was and what I was studying. I was studying political science and English.
Oh, me too. I
And
did political science. Yeah. No.
yeah, and it just didn't really, I wasn't really getting much out of it. And I was just feeling antsy as a 22-year-old. So I left to go teach English abroad in Poland for a year, and it was eye-opening in a number of ways. And I returned and did one more year at university, and that's when I started writing for my school paper, the Ontarian in Guelph. Shout out. And I was doing concert reviews and album reviews, and most importantly, interviews with musicians that would come through Guelph. And it was a remarkable way to just better understand how to talk to people. I mean, I grew up loving storytelling. I
Mhm.
was always the guy, at parties or whatever, trying to like weave what some people just saw as a simple event into this long
Mhm.
story. Anyway, yeah, and so after that, I after university, I went abroad and taught English abroad in a number of places: Istanbul, Australia, Vancouver. And I thought teaching was going to be what I was going to do, but all along I was writing kind of on the side for a variety of whether it was in Istanbul I was writing for Time Out magazine, which is the English magazine there. In Vancouver I was doing work for the Vancouver Sun. Australia I was writing for their weekly arts paper there, and it eventually it became something that dominated my thought process in the middle of English lessons, in the middle of teaching. But it's hard to do it full time. Um, when I moved to Toronto, I'm from just outside of Toronto, and when I moved to Toronto with my wife in 2013 to kind of put some roots down, I guess I really kind of decided that I had to go at it full time. So I was freelancing almost full time, teaching a little bit, but relentless in my pursuit of whether it was new opportunities or new stories. And I think that's something that I took away from that time. And I think if people ever ask about the not necessarily the keys to success, but what I did, it was just that relentlessness. Probably to my detriment at times. I couldn't really turn off, but I was
Mhm.
just so focused on succeeding in journalism. And it was around that time that I really switched from music to sports, because I just found myself thinking more and more about sports. And I think there were just more opportunities to talk to different people. And so by 2016, the Athletic had kind of was starting up in Toronto, and I was freelancing for them, and it took a few years before kind of landing full time with them. But I think it was because I wanted to do hockey and soccer.
Hmm.
So yeah, it was. I think in hindsight, it was just that kind of doggedness in terms of what I wanted. Probably because I knew secretly that working in sports journalism is, it's cliche, man, but it is one of the coolest jobs on the planet. I love my job. That's not something a lot of people get to say, partly
Hmm.
because it doesn't always feel like a job. It's not baling hay, right? Like I'm very fortunate to be able to do what I do, but it takes a lot of effort and work to get into that, right?
No, 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 of course. And that's an interesting just life story, really. And I wanted to go on to your book a little bit. And I know you just mentioned you were a music journalist and wrote about music. And I know that you wrote a book, a memoir about the Tragically Hip, and then you wrote a book about Toronto FC. So I wanted to talk about what your process is like to write a book, in this case the Voyageurs, and maybe describe, has there been any differences between those books that you wrote in terms of your process and what your process is like?
I think one of the kind of key lessons or things that I was told very early on in sports journalism, I have to give a lot of credit to my colleague, and I know he taught as well, Sean Fitzgerald, who is still one of the best sports writers in the country. Um, he would always tell me about the importance of getting multiple perspectives on one single event, right? He would always tell me, about the pen, and I see the pen from this angle, but it's different from like the way that he sees the pen. And so I think I really took that to heart, and very early on, both in reporting, but also in especially in writing the books, my goal was to always was to talk to as many people as possible, right? I think
Mhm.
you know, the Toronto FC, for example, were not around for a very long time, and you probably could have written that book talking to just two or three people, but talking to as many people as possible reveals different stories, creates kind of creates a bit of conflict in the narrative because you get these different perspectives, and it makes for a ton more transcribing. But just in terms of process, that was the kind of the key thing that was part of the writing for that Toronto FC book, was just talking to as many people as possible and figuring out the many different ways that this club, which is a special club, I think, in MLS, impacted lots of different people. And then in terms of like from book to book, I think with this book on the men's national team, the focus was again talking to a lot of people, but maybe focusing a little bit more on talking to people that don't often talk, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes when you talk to people, when you talk to people that are still in kind of the industry or whatever, they can be a bit guarded sometimes. But I tried with this book to get voices that were there for the entire kind of rise of the men's national team throughout a generation, but people that didn't either have a chance to tell their stories, or wouldn't be as kind of guarded. So that was definitely a focus of mine. Maybe fewer people, but longer interviews, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, and like, look, I think you have to, when it comes to writing this book, I think I was the timeline was a little bit tight because the publisher wanted to get it out before the World Cup, and I'm happy it is out before the
Yeah.
World Cup. But that just meant that getting it done in a short amount of time meant a lot of, I would start to write it at 5 a.m. every day. I would usually, like, in terms of process, I would usually transcribing interviews would be the last thing I do before bed, which isn't necessarily healthy, but it's the way you have to do. I'd be
Yeah.
transcribing interviews right before bed, and then you'd go to bed kind of thinking about that interview, and then you'd wake up with that interview as like the first thing on your brain, and that actually helped me. I would kind of wake up, um, this is super detailed, but I'd wake up, usually go for a walk or hit the treadmill for 20 minutes just to kind of get my thoughts together, and then sit down at the kitchen table and bang out as many pages as I could. And you do all that before you have to get the eggs ready for your toddler. And then the point is that's kind of the process that I kind of discovered worked for me. Because when you write a book, you have to be obsessed with the topic, for better or worse. But I was, and hopefully people get something out of it.
And just to go off that, what was your inspiration to write the Voyageurs? I know you mentioned on Northern Football that that game against Haiti was kind of a seminal moment or a genesis of the book. I just wanted you to speak to the inspiration to the Voyageurs.
Well, I mean, first of all, I appreciate the question. I do. Yeah, I had kind of, I think after the Toronto FC book, Come On You Reds, it probably took me a little bit longer to kind of find a book project that I wanted. I like writing books, I do. And once the men's national team started to get you could see a gradual improvement in their play, and with John Herdman and Alphonso Davies, it was clear something was happening, but it also, at first, it felt a little bit too soon. And I think, like a lot of people that follow Canadian soccer, I was couching all the enthusiasm by saying, yeah, but it's still the men's national team. Like there's disappointment around the corner somewhere. And I suppose there still could be. But once Canada qualified for the final round of qualifying, they had to go through the first round, the second round playing minnows, and they hadn't been to the final rounds since 1997. And I had been talking, I'd been doing radio hits, about the men's national team, and my publisher, Dundurn Press, who I worked with on the Toronto FC book, they kind of got in touch and they said, we've been hearing you on the radio again. Like, can we kick around some ideas? And we met the day after Canada did, beat Haiti and qualify for the last round of qualifying. Still, by no means a guarantee to make the World Cup. And we kicked around some ideas, and one idea that I just couldn't shake was framing this book much in the same way Ralph Honigstein, who it's incredible to call him a colleague at The Athletic, the way that he framed the German national team's rise in Das Reboot, which is a book that, just as a fan of the German national team, I've read way too many times to count. And I kind of shared this idea with my publisher. I said, I think there's a story about this men's national team, but more importantly, I think there's a story about the people that have helped this team get to where it is now. And some of these untold stories, I think, deserve to be told. And that's the way the book is framed. From 1986, their first World Cup, to now, it kind of tells the chronological story of this men's team's rise. But interspersed in that story are lengthy profiles about some of the people that have contributed to that rise. And there's a lot of themes within each of these profiles. Craig Forrest was a player that sacrificed a lot on the club side and probably missed out on some very big opportunities with big profile clubs to go play for Canada. That's not something a lot of players did. Craig's story is all about how, he sacrificed for Canada. Stephen Hart is a person that I really enjoyed profiling, because as the men's national team coach, he tried to kind of take the shackles off a team that was long just a defensive first team. And he tried to embody some of the multiculturalism and diversity that was really growing in the player pool and
Mhm.
bring these divergent styles of play off onto the pitch. And in 2007, when he takes over the team at the Gold Cup, they finally start playing attractive offensive front foot soccer for the first time ever. And so these are just some of the people that I wanted to profile. And I think that that was kind of the genesis for the book, was the people as much of the stories,
Yeah.
because that's the stuff that I like to do with the Athletics. So yeah, again, my hope is that people who are curious about this national team ahead of the World Cup read this and learn a little bit about the people that they didn't kind of know about before, right?
Yeah, no, and I'm really interested to read your book. I know you mentioned on Northern Football that you really thought the Atiba Hutchinson chapter was really something you really liked and liked to write about. So I'm excited to read that part because I think as I'm sure you know and would think that he's probably the most. I think you said that on the podcast that he's the best athlete, Canadian athlete no one's ever heard of, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so I just wanted to move a little bit to the team on the field and what was it like covering a Canadian men's national team that actually made the World Cup, and what were some of your most fondest memories of their run?
Yeah, it was surreal covering this team. I do remember very clearly, um, after that first game of that first final round of game and final round of qualifying, where they drew 1-1 at home. And, you know, I remember listening to Herdman after the game, and he said, look, I think some players on the team thought that they'd come out and they'd play tiki-taka and it would be easy, right? But the final round of CONCACAF is really tough. There's physicality, there's, you know, there's dark arts, and I remember thinking it was going to be a real upwards climb for this team. And I remember driving home on the QEW thinking in the back of my mind, oh, I actually I don't know if Canada's going to qualify, and I don't know what's going to happen with my book then, because I don't want to put it out
Yeah.
if they don't qualify. And from that game on, the ascent of the men's team through qualifying was legitimately became one of the best stories in Canadian sports history, because it was so rapid and it was so quick, and the way they galvanized the country by playing a front foot attacking style of football, the way they played without fear, the way they did so as a young and really likable outfit. Um, it was wild. You know, I think for me, you know, there were a few real turning points. I was there for every home game, including, you know, the game that I thought really turned things was at Panama, when they were home to Panama.
Mhm.
And you know, they go down 1-0, and you kind of, that was the moment where I was like, yeah, like this is
Yeah.
probably it. This is when the wheels come off. But they stay focused with their style of play, and they end up coming back 4-1, and Alfonso Davies scores a viral goal. And I remember at that point thinking, okay, this team is good.
Yeah.
And then I went to Edmonton to cover the two games there. And when they beat Mexico at home and do it in such a dramatic fashion, I remember thinking, okay, this team has a chance to go to the World Cup. They were top of the table at that point. And then when they beat the United States in Hamilton, I remember, and doing that without Alfonso Davies and Stefan Estacchio, I remember thinking that, okay, they're going to the World Cup. I was in Costa Rica for, I believe, I guess it was match day 12, when they could have clinched their World Cup berth. And I think the moment maybe got to them a little bit, but I also think Costa Rica was fighting for their lives. And so it was wild to be around the team then, when they're kind of on the precipice of history. And then obviously, you know, watching the team qualify at BMO Field, which
Yeah,
was
I was
probably,
there too. It was
yeah, it was wild just because it was fitting in so many ways. It was freezing, and the entire team's family was there. So what was interesting as well, just being around the team throughout qualifying, was how they didn't waver, right? This is a team that, And we saw it with Mexico, we saw it with the United States, we're really seeing it with the United States. There's dips, right? There's dips, there's ups and downs. This team, it was all up, right? Just game by game, they got better. Game by game, they garnered new fans. The TV numbers grew. So just game by game, it just the trajectory just kept moving up and up and up. And it was interesting for me. I used that as fuel a bit to write this book because I just felt energized in a lot of ways, right? So yeah, it was a wild. It was something like that qualifying run is something I'll genuinely never forget.
To move on to, they've just made the World Cup, and I still kind of find it just incredible to see them and think about them in a month's time playing in the World Cup. What are your expectations for Canada at the World Cup? I know you mentioned that you thought their schedule benefits them in terms of who they play. Would you just kind of give me your maybe expectations for Canada at the World Cup?
I mean, if the way that they played against Qatar and Uruguay in the friendlies this week or over this last week is any indication, my expectations are that they play front foot soccer in a way that I wondered if they wouldn't. You know, I remember I think back to when they were away to the United States in qualifying, and they kind of bunkered a little bit, but you watch the way that they really took the game to Uruguay, and obviously they didn't get the result. Probably,
Yeah.
they just needed the finishing. But my expectations are that they go after the games in against Belgium and Croatia, and I probably wouldn't have said that a few months ago. My expectations are that they find the back of the net. I think obviously somebody will score Canada's first ever goal at a World Cup. I think in terms of predictions, right, it's reasonable to expect them to get one, maybe two draws. And I do expect that Alphonso Davies will take over a game at some point. It remains to be seen to me which one, but I do think he has the capacity to take over a game. And if he can do that in the right circumstances, that perhaps happens against Morocco, and they somehow get a win, we're talking about them going through to the next round, which is kind of wild. But I think a draw or two is probably a reasonable expectation. I think we saw against Uruguay the gap between the good teams and the great teams in world football is big, and so. But if Canada can stick to their identity, and if they can play, without any fear and not cower to the moment, then I don't think it's unreasonable to expect them to find the back of the net, get some draws, and maybe surprise some people.
Who would maybe be the player you're most excited to watch at the big stage at the World Cup? I think maybe most would say Alphonso Davies, but is there a player that you're just really excited to be maybe shown off to the world at the World Cup for Canada?
Yeah, I would say, I don't know if it's the best term to use, but I would say my favorite player to watch on this men's national team is Stefan Eustáquio. And I say that partly because I love that kind of player, that intelligent, hardworking, deep lying midfielder. I mean, growing up, Bastian Schweinsteiger was always my favorite player. My son's name is Bastian. I don't like to. My wife doesn't love me kind of mentioning that as often as I do. But yeah, and I think I'm not. This is not. There's not necessarily parallels, but I think Stefan Eustáquio has a lot of those qualities in that he is dependable. He is so smart in the way he finds his spots in the middle of the pitch, and he's so relentless with his work rate, and he's so good at beginning the transition play for Canada. And I think that's what's important, because John Herdman has told me, and he'll probably tell anyone that asks, if this team is going to be successful in Qatar, it's going to be because of their transition game. And you need someone in the back to kind of basically start the transition, progress the ball. And I think that's Stefan Eustáquio. I think he plays every single minute in the World Cup, and I think he's at a great club in Porto, but I genuinely believe the sky is the limit for the player because his confidence is sky high. And I think, again, it's cliche, but people talk about what this new Canadian team is. And I think he embodies that new attitude, confidence, fearlessness that was really missing in the men's national team for a generation.
Hmm. My one question, or before I let you go, how excited are you for the World Cup, and are you going to Qatar to cover it?
I am, and I
Wow.
literally have to pinch myself all the time. It'll be my first World Cup working, and you know, I hope I just hope I do a service to the readers and the people that have subscribed to read the stuff that we do about the Canadian men's national team. I'm kind of I will admit right now I'm a little more concerned about making sure there's enough kind of help for my wife and my 4-year-old son when I'm gone. But yeah, I am over the moon excited about it, and I'm ready to dive in
Yeah.
with 2 feet, 2 arms, whatever. I'm
Yeah.
excited.
And so, where can people buy the Voyageurs and find it? And is there anything else you want to plug for the Athletic too? You also write for the Maple Leafs. Anything the listeners should keep their eyes and ears open for, other than obviously buying your book? Again, comes out October 4th.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the runway to do that. I there's a lot coming out at the Athletic. I think what my goal leading up to the World Cup is to tell the stories of the people again, just as I did with the Voyageurs, but tell the stories of the people and the players that got there. So we have a lot of great stories coming up. A lot of behind the scenes stuff that I think a lot of fans will appreciate. But yeah, with the Voyageurs, you can buy the book anywhere you buy books, and I mean that absolutely anywhere. I always suggest people to give their local indie bookstore downtown a call and see if they have it, and if they don't, ask them to order it, and they will. But yeah, it's available October 4th anywhere you buy books. And again, I genuinely hope people learn something about the men's national team because you know if they go to Qatar and they get a result there, it has the potential to be one of the biggest stories in Canadian sports history. And I think there's something a lot of people can take out of this, because what we're going to see from this men's national team at the World Cup could end up be a turning point in a shifting Canadian sports landscape, because this men's national team going to the World Cup and piggybacking off the women's national team
Yeah.
success, it needs to be said. But them going to the World Cup, we could look back at it as kind of a point when soccer became not just the third or fourth most popular sport in the country, but it could end up being the point where we genuinely talk about soccer years from now as when it started to become the most popular sport in the country, because I don't think we're that far off. If you look
Yeah.
at the changing demographics, the changing economy, how expensive it is to play hockey, everything that's going on with hockey right now, it's not unreasonable to expect that one day soccer is the most popular sport in Canada. And I think this World Cup is going to be a big part of that.
Well, thank you so much, Joshua, for coming on. I really appreciate it. You're taking your time, and really excited to read your book.
Thank you so much for having me on. I do appreciate it.
Listeners of Behind the Play, we'll have a couple cool episodes coming up in the future. So stay tuned and see you soon.